Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by Nathaniel Rakich, who's a senior editor and election analyst at 538. His writing has been widely published in places like The Atlantic and the Boston Globe, and his work at 538 has been regularly featured across the media landscape over the last few years. He also happens to be our last guest of 2023. Nathaniel, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Victoria. Thanks for having me.
So some of our listeners might not know that you're also a huge baseball fan. I mean, your Twitter handle is BaseBallot. So I'm going to throw you a softball to start off. Who's your favorite baseball team?
Well, it's complicated, actually. I grew up a big Red Sox fan because I grew up in the Boston area. But I've kind of grown out of that. I've kind of gotten out of the idea that you should root for a team basically through thick and thin. The Red Sox have not been too good lately. And in particular, they traded Mookie Betts, who was their best player a few years ago. And basically, I thought at that point, if the Red Sox aren't going to care about their fans, why should I care about them? So since then, I've been a little bit of an itinerant baseball fan. Definitely more of a fan of the game overall than any specific team. It's fun to kind of pick a team and root for them in the playoffs, for example. The last couple of years, I've been pulling for the Phillies. I briefly lived in Philadelphia and enjoyed my time there. But now I live in Washington, D.C., and the Nationals aren't very good, but they're up and coming. So looking forward to getting to know a new team and rooting for some exciting young players.
I abide by that philosophy too. My husband was a huge Cubs fan, and now we live in Dallas. So we're kind of Rangers fans now. We're pretty excited about the World Series most recently.
Bandwagon fans get a bad rap, but you deserve, as fans, we deserve a team that really tries their hardest. And frankly, I appreciate when a team backs up the money truck they did with the Dodgers did with Shohei Ohtani recently. It's really exciting, and that is a good reason to be a fan of a team. Whereas if your team isn't doing much, they're just not giving much to you. You deserve better, fans.
Exactly. That's great. Well, let's take a look. We're less than a year away from the presidential election now, and everyone in this political media world, as you and me, are preparing for the marathon of the election cycle. We've had a few pollsters on the show in the past few months, and each has kind of talked about how polling works and also which polls we can trust. There's so much conflicting information out there about that. So after the 2022 midterms, you wrote that polls were historically accurate in 2022. So can you explain why you think that's the case?
Yeah. Well, to be perfectly honest, I think, there was a degree of luck. Obviously the polling industry is going through, there are some challenging times, right? People, because of caller ID, people aren't picking up the phone as often. And, it's all the proliferation of cell phones and stuff. And, basically all pollsters worth their weight now will call cell phones. But, pollsters are experimenting with different methods online and even text messages to see if they can get better response rates. And really, it's quite impressive that polls have remained pretty accurate despite all the challenges that are facing the industry. But yeah, just to put some numbers on it. So we kind of ran the numbers on how kind of the average error of polls in the 2022 election versus previous cycles. And the error is just the difference between the margin of the election and the margin of the polls. And on average in the 2022 cycle, the races that we analyzed, so Senate, Governor, House, had an average error of only 4.8 points, which again is the most accurate since at least 1998, which was as far back as we did this exercise. Obviously, there have been some high-profile polling misses in recent years, particularly in presidential years. In 2016, obviously, the polls indicated that Hillary Clinton was going to win. She didn't. In 2020, the polls kind of quote unquote called the winner correctly in that they said that Joe Biden was going to win, but the polls, as folks probably remember, showed that Biden was basically going to win in a landslide, and he ended up winning kind of by the skin of his teeth by some pretty narrow margins in some states. But overall, it's important to note that the error really, there's no long-term trend of polls becoming less accurate over time, the way that you might expect given all the challenges in the industry. And again, by virtue of the fact that in 2022, they were actually the most accurate they've been, it shows that pollsters are very capable of adapting to these new environments, and whatever they did in 2022 worked. That said, it doesn't necessarily mean that 2024 polls will be super accurate either. There, are a lot of theories about why the polls, quote unquote, missed in 2016 and 2020. Some of them focus on the idea that maybe there's something about supporters of Donald Trump in particular that are difficult to poll. Obviously, it looks like Donald Trump will probably be on the ballot again in 2024, so that could, mess some things up. It could also just be there could be other factors. So in 2016, there was a lot of talk about how pollsters weren't weighting by education, and education has obviously become a big dividing line. For example, white people who with college degrees vote very differently now from white people without college degrees. Pollsters have generally adapted to that. A lot of pollsters are weighting by education now. In 2020, it could have just been factors due to the pandemic. Maybe Democrats were staying home more and they were more likely to answer polls. And obviously, hopefully, that won't be an issue in 2024. The polling basically in 2024 could be very good like it was in 2022. It could be more of a miss like it was in 2016 and 2020. The overall important thing to note is just that polls aren't ever going to be 100% accurate, right? Even that number that I cited for 2022, 4.8 points on average error, a lot of races are within 5 points, and that would mean that, a poll would quote unquote call an election wrong. But really, if a poll says so-and-so candidate is winning by 2 points, that's basically just tantamount to a tie. That's within the statistical margin of error, and people should think about it that way.
That's really interesting. So with that data set that you have as far as average error rates, was 2016 the highest in that, going back to 1980, whatever?
Actually, 1998 was the highest. Okay. It had an average error of 7.7, but this century, yes, 2016 was the highest. It had an average error of 6.8 points.
Very interesting. Before we dig into some of your more latest work, you also penned a really nifty guide on how to read polls like a pro. The article listed 10 tips for knowing which polls to trust and how to make sense of them. We're not going to run through all of them, but could you give us some of the most important things to keep in mind heading into 2024?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that I always tell people is kind of what I already mentioned, which is that polls have this thing called margin of error. Whenever you take a poll of only 500 people and, say that it is representative of a broader population, there's going to be you can't, it's not possible, obviously, to poll all, 10 million people in a state or whatever. And so we do settle for these smaller sample sizes. And they do historically come quite close to an actual statewide result, provided that they're kind of weighted appropriately and conducted professionally. But there is always going to be this unavoidable amount of error. So when you see next to a poll, Biden is leading Trump by 2 points, but this poll has a margin of error of 3 points. Think of it as basically a statistical tie. So that basically means, so actually the margin of error, this is a little bit of a nerdy aside, but the margin of error applies to both candidates' vote share. So let's say that the poll had Biden at 50% and Trump at 48%, and the margin of error is 3 points. That means that Biden could be anywhere from 53% to 47%, and it means that Trump could be anywhere from 51% to 45%. And obviously there's an overlap there in which Trump is actually leading Biden. And so it's just important for people to think about polls as estimates rather than precise measures of, down to the decimal point or whatever. So that's one thing. Another important one, I think, is just to look at the population of who's being polled. So some pollsters or some polls will look at polls of all adults, of Americans, and that'll be things like often like Biden's approval rating, because we're interested in what all Americans think about how Biden or how they think about Biden. But other polls will be of likely voters in a specific election. And that's kind of the best type of poll when you're trying to use something to predict an election, because a lot of adults don't vote. They can't vote, they're not registered, or, they're just, maybe they're registered, but they're more apathetic. And even some election polls will poll registered voters, and you just have to know, especially this far out from an election, really pollsters don't switch over to polling likely voters typically until a few months before the election, because it's hard for people to know whether they're going to vote or not. But people who are likely voters tend to be more engaged, and the results can look different from the registered voter polls, or certainly from the polls of all adults. What other things? Obviously, it's important to know, I think this was a kind of a big consideration in 2022, is that kind of consider who's sponsoring the poll. Some sponsors and even some pollsters are partisan, and they may have an incentive to overstate their party's position. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're making up data, but there are kind of some subjective decisions that go into when you conduct a poll. Like, you can construct maybe an optimistic turnout environment for your party, for example. So like, if you are a Democratic pollster, maybe you're going to assume that, like, the African American populations turn out at like record numbers or something like that. And that's probably not going to happen. It could, it's reasonable, but it probably isn't going to happen. And maybe that's going to inflate the Democratic vote share a little bit. So, and also, like, sometimes a campaign will release a poll, and like, you have to really think about, like, okay, why are they releasing this poll? And often it'll be in order to kind of gain an advantage in the race, and maybe to argue to donors that they are more viable than they really are. So it's important to treat polls like that with skepticism, which isn't to say, like, don't believe the polls or don't trust the polls, which is a thing that we hear a lot that we at 538 like fight against. Their polls are still our best source for predicting elections and also just measuring public opinion in general. But you do have to think critically about who is conducting it. Things like, the margin of error, things like the population that's polled, even things like the dates, right? So like, sometimes you'll get a poll, say it's a week before the election, a new poll comes out, but then you look in the fine print and actually this poll was conducted like 3 weeks ago, and it's actually old, and maybe there was a debate in the interim and something changed about the race. So like, it's really important to look at the details and not just kind of the top line numbers of the poll.
Those are all really good points, especially in our kind of clickbait society where we just grab the first number instead of reading into everything. So really good points there. GOP presidential primary debates have been going on the last few months. There's 2 more scheduled for January, one right before the Iowa caucuses and one a few days after in New Hampshire. So what are you watching between now and then?
Yeah, really, I'm watching Donald Trump's number and his standing. Like, that is the kind of the be all and end all, right? Is that we've had these debates. They haven't featured Donald Trump. They have at times been entertaining. I think they've been helpful for Nikki Haley in particular. We at 538 conduct a regular poll with Washington Post and Ipsos after each debate, or before and after each debate, looking at how voters change their minds. And consistently after each debate, Nikki Haley gets among the strongest score. We ask them to like basically grade each candidate about how they did in the debate. Nikki Haley is always one of the top performers. She's also often like gets the biggest jump in terms of people saying they're considering voting for her. And you've seen this in the national polling. So we at 538 have our average of national GOP primary polls and also a few states. But you've seen Nikki Haley go up from, I think it was like 3% nationally before the first debate to she's now in double digits. I think it's like 10 or 11%. And I think that is due to her strong performance in debates. But at the end of the day, right, like it's kind of a race between her and DeSantis to finish second, unless something happens with Donald Trump, who is polling up in like the high 50s. And in some of the early states, he's doing a little bit weaker. So for example, in Iowa and New Hampshire, he is weaker, but he's still like 20 or 30 points ahead of DeSantis or Haley. And that something about that is going to have to change, because if Donald Trump does end up getting even 40% of the vote in Iowa and New Hampshire, he's going to win a majority of the delegates there. He's going to have all the momentum. Kind of on the flip side, like if somebody like DeSantis can pull off an upset in Iowa, if Nikki Haley can pull off an upset in New Hampshire, does that scramble the race and maybe, send a signal that like, oh, DeSantis or Haley, that's the person that all the rest of us who don't really want Trump need to rally around? Or is it just going to be a fluke because those states kind of often go their own way? They tend to take their responsibilities very seriously in terms of being kind of winnowing the field and picking candidates. And maybe a lot of those people are like going to rallies and meeting the candidates personally. But in a lot of these like bigger Super Tuesday states, for example, like the voters aren't necessarily putting as much thought into their vote. And maybe that redounds to Trump's benefit because he has such high recognition and popularity within the party. So, I don't know. I guess I'm watching a lot of things before Iowa and New Hampshire.
And how much of these debates are an audition to be Trump's candidate for VP? Because you said they're going to likely be runner-ups, but does that mean that they even have a chance for being picked as his vice president?
Yeah, that's a great question. So 538 actually published an article about this like a couple of months ago. And we actually found that it has become increasingly rare for winning candidates in the primary, to pick one of their ex-rivals as vice president. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's only happened like a handful of times in the last few decades. So I actually think it's unlikely that any of them will get picked as Trump's vice presidential nominee. Not to mention the fact that a lot of the debates have focused on them kind of, they haven't gone after Trump super hard, with the exception of Chris Christie, but, they are dinging him. Ron DeSantis has some choice words for Donald Trump sometimes. Nikki Haley, I think, has been pretty critical, and Trump has posted on Truth Social after the debates, basically being like, hey, Nikki Haley's so disloyal after she's in my administration and everything. So I think that, arguably the better they do in the debates by distinguishing themselves, and it makes them more of a target for Trump's wrath, and that actually probably maybe lowers their chances of being vice president or the vice presidential nominee. I think the easiest one to imagine would be somebody like Tim Scott, who of course is no longer in the race, who really didn't rock the boat, and I think maybe that's part of why he didn't get a lot of momentum, is that he didn't really stand out. But he's somebody, I think, maybe an example of somebody who, while he technically ran against Trump, didn't really burn any bridges with Trump. And maybe you could see Trump picking him. Although I guess I should also say that Vivek Ramaswamy, who has been pretty explicitly pro-Trump, has certainly not burned his bridges, and reportedly Trump has been impressed with him. But I think for a variety of reasons, he's an unlikely pick as well.
Switching sides, can you give us some insight into Biden's polling lately, both generally and in some swing states?
Yeah, it's been a tough stretch for Biden. He actually recently hit his all-time low in terms of his approval rating in 538's polling average, which was 37%, or maybe it was 37.6, which would round up to 38. But it started with a 3 and a 7. But yeah, it's been hard for him. Obviously, there have also been a lot of polls for people who are, hopefully the people listening to this are not addicted to the internet like I am and following every single poll and the reaction on Twitter. But there has been a lot of reaction. There have been a lot of bad polls for Biden lately showing Trump beating him in the general election, including in swing states. There were some CNN polls recently that showed him losing big in Michigan, for example. The thing about that, I think, is it's interesting. There's basically been a debate about how seriously should we take these polls. And I think that maybe to borrow a phrase, right, the best way to think about it is to take them seriously, but not literally. So empirically, we can look at how accurate polls from the year before the election are in terms of predicting the eventual outcome. And the answer is they're basically not predictive. There have been wild swings historically, double digits in the polls between this point in the cycle and then on election day. So really, there isn't a lot of reason to think that the polls right now are going to be predictive. That said, they are, I just talked about how accurate polls are in general. I think they are valid measures of how the electorate feels right now. And I think there could be various reasons for that. I think one of the more plausible theories is that a lot of Biden's base is unsatisfied with him and his conduct over the war in Israel, for example. Young voters, obviously, in particular, are particularly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause in that. Young voters, of course, are a key part of the Democratic coalition, and they have given him some pretty bad marks on that issue. Even though normally you'd expect young voters to be more approving of Biden, for example, than older voters. And so the question, I think, becomes: are those voters saying that they disapprove of Biden, or more to the point, that are they saying that they would actually vote for Trump over Biden right now? Are they serious about that? Would they actually vote that way in a year's time? And I think that's kind of an impossible question to answer, right? There is this phenomenon in polling called expressive responding, which is that if a pollster picks up the phone and you've just maybe come back from, this is an extreme example, but you've come back from a protest about Biden's Israel policy, and they ask you if you're going to vote for Biden or Trump, you might not be inclined to say that you're going to vote for Biden, especially at a time, frankly, when Donald Trump hasn't been in the news a lot. We had earlier this year had obviously a bunch of news cycles about his indictments and stuff like that. And I think we're going to return to those news cycles when his trials happen. But right now, there hasn't been a lot about Donald Trump. He isn't really rocking the boat. Biden has had a lot of bad headlines. And so maybe those people are going to tell a pollster, no, I'm going to vote for Trump. But are they actually going to do that in the thick of an election season when, Trump is, perhaps has been convicted of something, or, Trump is also being very vocal about his Israel policy, which presumably those voters wouldn't like either. So the question is, sorry, I'm rambling, but the question is whether they're just telling pollsters that as kind of a way to blow off steam, or whether they are serious and they would actually vote for Trump. And I think that is unknowable. And I think that certainly if I were the Biden campaign, again, I would be taking those polls seriously, even if they maybe not wouldn't be taken literally at this point. But like, it's clearly an issue for him. He needs to, I think, shore up those voters, young voters of color also are another group that, if you compare like how, voters of color typically vote for Democrats in past elections to the way they are in the polls right now, there's like a lot more Black voters and Hispanic voters are saying they're going to vote for Trump or for Republicans. And that's just, I think it just points to an area that Biden really needs to focus on in the next year for his campaign. And maybe he will succeed in winning them over, and maybe he won't. But that is kind of unknowable at this time. So yeah, I would say that, the early polls aren't necessarily worth freaking out about. Certainly if you are a normal, like Democrat who's just observing things. If you're working for the Biden campaign, then maybe it's something you should take seriously. But otherwise, I generally recommend that people don't start paying attention to general election polls until the spring.
This might be an impossible question, but I'm going to ask anyways. Do you think the election polling or his approval rating give a better picture of his political future?
I think in general, the election polling is going to do a better job. Certainly as we get closer and closer, there are kind of these broad, you can look like 2 years out at the election and look at presidents and how popular they are. And like generally speaking, presidents who are like super popular tend to win, like 2 years before tend to win re-election, and presidents who are underwater tend not to. Trump being an example of the latter, for example. But there is just a lot of time for those things to change. And more to the point, like certainly in the year of the election, like those head-to-head polls are actually measuring the thing you're curious about. What you're curious about is whether he's going to win re-election. Because elections, this is a bit of a cliche, but like elections are a choice rather than a referendum. And the approval rating polls are basically the referendum. It's like, do you approve or disapprove of Biden? But it's possible for somebody obviously to disapprove of Biden, but maybe to think that Donald Trump is even worse. And in fact, that is the gamble that, Biden is hoping that those people will, I guess Biden is hoping that he'll get super popular and, everybody will like him. But perhaps a more realistic scenario is that he's hoping that some of these people who disapprove of him, maybe those young voters, those skeptical voters of color, they'll be like, well, I don't really like Biden, but like Donald Trump is worse, and I'm going to hold my nose and vote for Biden.
And then down, I guess not the middle, but independents, if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. makes it on the ballot in all 50 states as an independent, do you think he'll be spoiling one party more so than the other?
Yeah, I think there are arguments on both sides, but I think that on net, he probably will take more voters away from Republicans than from Democrats. Obviously, the fact that he used to be a Democrat and he has the Kennedy name, suggests that maybe he'll reel in some Democrats who are nostalgic for that, or maybe are more to the point aren't as familiar with him. But a lot of his views are kind of more congruent with like right-wing views and frankly, like, a lot of more conspiratorial thoughts, like his opposition to vaccines. And that just kind of jibes more with the Republican side these days. And if you look at polls of his favorability, he's seen a lot more favorably among Republicans than he is among Democrats. And so to the extent he pulls away votes, I think it'll probably be more from the Republican side. That said, I'm generally skeptical. Like, he's starting off in a lot of these early polls in like the double digits and like the teens or something like that. And that's certainly like something, again, to be taken seriously, but not literally. Historically, third-party candidates almost always lose ground in the polls as we get closer to the election. Again, people kind of get into campaign mode and they maybe start, it's a convenient place, again, to park your vote for now if you don't like either Biden or Trump. But when it's October 2024 and you're seeing all of them and actually campaigning, and maybe you learn about some views of RFK that you didn't know about because he was just kind of a protest vote for you, quote unquote. And when you were taking a poll like the previous year, maybe you come to the realization that like, hey, like, it's going to be either Biden or Trump. I live in a swing state. Say I live in Georgia. Like, I don't want to throw my vote away. So I'm just going to, I don't like Trump, but I like him better than Biden. So I'm going to vote for him. So in general, like, RFK is starting from a pretty high place, but I would be pretty surprised if he won more than, say, 5% of the vote in the end. That said, 5% of the vote that in a close election could be enough to influence the outcome. But yeah, I think it's not going to be a Ross Perot situation.
Let's move on to this past November's election. You wrote an article that was pretty insightful. I'd like to touch on two major points. Throughout the year, you noted that Democrats have had a stronger showing than most analysts predicted. So what do you think Democrats should make of their successes in both special elections and then this past general election in November?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting thing, too, is that we do have this apparent gap between what the polls are saying, especially lately with Biden really doing terribly in them, and these special elections in which, as you mentioned, if you kind of measure against like a neutral partisan baseline, like how a district typically votes in like presidential races, for example, or even in say legislative races, Democrats have consistently through all year long in 2023 been doing better than those partisan baselines. And actually for this article, I used data from Ballotpedia. You guys do a great job of tracking state legislative special elections. So thank you for that. But it's been a really interesting phenomenon that Democrats have continued to overperform. And I think it's very easy to say that like, oh, Democrats are, more energized these days because of the Dobbs decision, or they, a lot of like basically like college educated white people who tend to be they're like the most likely people to go to the polls in like low information elections, like special elections. They tend to be Democrats these days. But historically, special election results and specifically overperformance in special elections has correlated pretty well with the eventual outcome of the House popular vote in the actual like regularly scheduled even year election. So I don't think we should dismiss them out of hand, but it is kind of an interesting kind of contrast to the polls. In terms of the 2023 elections, specifically like Virginia and Kentucky and things like that, I took a look in this article that you referenced at kind of how predictive they've been historically. And basically I found that so like Kentucky and Mississippi, the governor's elections there, like they really have no bearing. And I think this probably is intuitive to folks, but like governor's elections, first of all, can often be very like localized, and it's easy for a governor to have like a specific brand. So obviously like Andy Beshear, who won re-election in Kentucky, he is seen as a moderate and he has like a famous last name in Kentucky, and voters there really do distinguish him from the National Democratic Party. On the flip side, think about somebody like former Governor Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, my home state, who like obviously was able to win an extremely blue state, but by being like basically resembling not at all the National Republican Party. So those elections didn't really mean very much. I also took a look at like Virginia and New Jersey state legislative elections and how predictive they've been historically, kind of looking in a similar way as the special elections. Like if like a certain party like does consistently better than like the base partisanship in those districts, does it mean good things for them in the subsequent election? And I found like there's a bit of a directional pattern. So like in years where Democrats, although I didn't go back that far, but because the data is quite difficult to collect. But like, for example, in the 2017 elections in Virginia, Democrats did quite well. And then, of course, they ended up doing well in the 2018 midterms, regularly scheduled. But the like exact magnitude was pretty different. So like, I don't think that you can go and look at like the popular vote in Virginia and be like, that's going to be the popular vote in the House. But this year you saw like kind of like, Democrats obviously won the control of both chambers in Virginia, but they didn't like overperform by a huge amount. I think actually Republicans slightly overperformed if you're looking at kind of the base partisanship. So basically, I think that means like anything could happen. Like we're in kind of a neutral environment, maybe, which is different from what the special elections say, which again is another puzzle. But also just given the variability of that and the special elections, like the special elections aren't a one-to-one thing either. Like it's kind of like polls, frankly, in the margin of error. Like, we had maybe Virginia elections this year maybe signaled a neutral political environment. But that means that you could have anywhere from a modest Democratic win to a modest Republican win. Like that stat also has a margin of error historically. So I'm just not sure that it's telling us much anymore. So like, unfortunately, like I'm a political junkie and I want to know what happens in 2024 too. But like, I think we just have to wait and see.
Another piece to this puzzle is redistricting. And there's a lot of states that may have their maps redrawn before 2024. On December 12th, the New York Supreme Court actually ruled that state's map must be redrawn by the independent redistricting committee in that state. So how will that affect who controls the House in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, these are big deals, I think. And obviously, like, they go in different directions. So like the New York case, that's something that could benefit Democrats. Folks may or may not know, but New York Democrats originally drew a gerrymander after the 2020 census, but then it got thrown out in court and a more neutral map was put in place. That's the map that was just thrown out on December 12th. Democrats are so the Independent Redistricting Commission is going to have a chance to redraw the map, but they might probably have trouble coming to an agreement between kind of all the members on there. And then if that happens, then it gets thrown to the legislature. So I think there is an expectation that the Democrats in the legislature are going to be able to draw that map and will draw maybe not as aggressive a gerrymander as last time because they don't want the map to get thrown out again, but something that benefits them and can maybe net them 2 or 3 seats. The final map will be really interesting to see. But then in other states, like in North Carolina being the most prominent example, Republicans got the chance to redraw the maps this year and drew something that was a fairly, a good map for Republicans, a kind of a red gerrymander. And they're probably going to net like 3 seats there in North Carolina. And then you've also had these cases in Alabama, which has added a new black opportunity seat that will almost certainly elect a Democrat. Louisiana might do the same. Georgia might do the same. So a lot of these things, like it's really interesting, and there are different kind of legal questions at work in each case. Some of them are about kind of racial gerrymandering and voting rights, and some are more just like a question of partisan fairness. But I think that those are the stories that people should really be covering right now, because like these are like if you draw a map that has a safely Democratic district that like would have voted for Joe Biden by like 60 points or something like that, like that's basically ironclad. Like you can take that to the bank. You don't need a poll to tell you that is going to be like a gain for Democrats or whatever. So at a time when obviously like there was a lot of drama with like the speaker election and like ousting Kevin McCarthy and stuff, and that is an important governing story. But there was also a lot of talk about like is this going to like hurt Republicans' chances in 2024 because it's going to show that they like can't govern or can't get their kind of act together. But I think that like the actual redrawing of maps is going to have a much bigger impact on who wins the House in 2024 than the ousting of Kevin McCarthy and how long it took them to elect a new speaker.
Are there any other storylines like that may play into 2024 as well? Maybe like something like no presidential debates.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There is that question about whether we're going to have presidential debates. I think in general elections, debates don't necessarily matter as much, or sometimes you can see like a little bit of a bump from them, but they tend to fade. So I'm actually not sure how much. I'm not sure that would affect things too much. But that's a great question in terms of other storylines in 2024. I mean, there was a question, I guess there still is a question about the economy and whether, we're going to go into a recession. It seems like maybe we've achieved the kind of soft landing that the people were hoping for, which I think obviously would be good for Biden. What's interesting is that a lot of traditional economic indicators are looking up right now. Like unemployment is low, like economic growth is strong. Inflation is, like prices are still rising, but at a slower rate than they were, a year or two ago. But Biden doesn't seem to be getting credit for that. But it'll be interesting to see if maybe in a year from now, once like the memories of the inflation in, earlier in his term or maybe have faded a little bit, if that gets better for him, or if economists are wrong and it turns out we're not on a soft landing and we do have a recession, I think that would obviously be bad for him. Another storyline, obviously, that I mentioned earlier is Trump's legal issues. If he gets convicted, there are a lot of polls saying that like a majority of Americans flatly would not vote for a convicted felon. It's, I think, an open question about if that comes into conflict with the fact that basically half of Americans like Donald Trump or like, or would vote for Donald Trump over Biden, which of those two impulses would win out. But I think obviously that's going to be a big storyline in the following year. And then maybe another one is just kind of how long the war in Israel lasts, or maybe more to the point, how much it continues to hang in American headlines. It does seem like it has not been a good story for Biden and has kind of divided his base. Is that going to continue throughout 2024? And will it still be an issue in November 2024? I don't know. But I think it's something that Biden would probably like to resolve sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. Those are all the questions I have for you. So I want to just thank you again for coming on here, for being a political junkie. I feel like this conversation was very accessible for our listeners. So I thank you for that. And thanks for using Ballotpedia's work. We're always glad to help.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of you guys. Use it all the time, refer to it, before elections, certainly. The wealth of information you have is really remarkable. So keep up the good work.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about Nathaniel's work at the link in our show notes. On the Ballot, we'll be taking a break until the new year, but we hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.